This is the Ghost from Star Wars Rebels and the Ahsoka series. The original instructions are by 2Bricks, and they're available for $20 on Rebrickable. I made a lot of modifications to the ship along the way. And this video is a building tour. We're reviewing the building process, showing what's cool about the original instructions, but also doing my own little modifications here and there, and sometimes not so little modifications. I'm about 120 steps into this build, and so far I've got a really good positive impression of this ship, of this build. It's clever, it's well built, it's structurally sound. We have this cool little thing where they can take in cargo from space, or from being pulled in from a height or something. I think it was featured in 1 or 2 shows at least. I'm only in season 2 of Rebels. And we've got this cool ramp at the front. Now amidships, I assume this is amidships, I see we've got this really clever building technique to make these slopes. So those are sloped plates, and we've got this bar here that's being suspended between these 2 little studs with holes in them. And then that goes into these little bits. I don't know what these things are called. They're modified plates with a hole in one end, and then there's a black Technic pin in there. And this allows the whole thing to be sloped, and it's locked in place at the bottom, but then it can also move. This is a really clever building technique, and I love it. But I'm gonna have to take it out because I want this central area to be more cargo bay. So I'm going to replace these very clever engineered bits with just doors. So they're going to be sloped doors that can then come open like this way, lower down to take in cargo on the starboard and port sides. And then also I want to build this into a little door. So right now it's got sort of this idea of a door, or I don't know, greebles. But I want this to be an actual door so the crew can get in there if they need to, but the main idea is that these 2 bays are for cargo. And then this, I assume, is mostly also for cargo, although of course you have these big doors at the bottom, which seems like that would interfere with the ability to store anything. Because this is a freighter after all. It's kind of, like holding cargo is kind of the main idea here of the original design of the ship within the universe. I'm now 201 steps into building the Ghost, and I've made a few changes. So let's start at the cargo bay amidships. We have this little door. This is for the crew to access these cargo spaces. And the crew would normally not really go in there, but they can if they need to. These are now doors that can open. And I might tweak these again because these angles should be a little steeper. We'll see. There's also some lights in the cargo bays. So we're adding the freight to the freighter. And at the front, we've got this gun turret, which the original design could swivel back and forth, but this one can now go up and down. And a very tiny change I made is making sure that this control panel is held in place on 2 sides and not just one side. Here's a little workshop video. We're going to zoom in on this part, which is going to be an airlock door that can swing open, but it will also be able to retract. And let's take a look at that mechanism. It's still under construction, so that's why it's kind of falling out there. And now we're going to look at this retraction mechanism. So it's protracted, retracted, protracted, retracted, protracted, retracted, This is a little stopper that makes sure that the motion only goes so far, and there will also be some coverings over this so that these bars here have only one axis of movement, back and forward. So what's an airlock even look like in the Star Wars universe? Looks cool, damn it, that's what it looks like. Now we have a working airlock. Well, I mean, working, you know, for Lego. So here's the door, opens up and then retracts. And we also have an inner door. Of course, you never open the inner door at the same time as the outer door, because then you evacuate all the air from the ship. And we've also got some openings. So these parts in the original instructions, these triangular bits are solid triangles, but I put an opening here so that I can create a little passageway into whatever is aft, which I assume is going to be like cargo and maybe some engineering, maybe some fuel. Over here I've got another opening for the head. However, I think it's in the wrong place. It needs to be a little bit farther this way because it's just going to butt into into a room over here. So I'm going to have to remodel this triangular bit. Has this been your experience? When I do Lego, I have to build a thing, I tear it back because it's not quite right, and then I rebuild it, and then it's still not right, so I have to tear it back again. And then maybe the third time it's right. But we've got a good airlock. I'm pretty sure that's good. The Ghost's airlock is done. This is on the starboard side, and this door can open up and then retract. And look, there's a little guy inside the airlock. I'll give a full tour of that later on. That's the starboard side. And then on the port side, I decided that I needed to build an escape pod. And of course, escape pods in the Star Wars universe always got to have this windshield. Like, that's just a requirement. If you're building an escape pod and it's the Star Wars universe, there's your windshield. And to make room for that, I had to make the floor lower. So I lowered the floor, and there it is. And maybe hopefully that escape pod will fit in there, and that'll be pretty cool. So we're making some progress with that escape pod, but I'm going to show that a little bit later once it's really finished. The only thing I wanted to show right now is this little missile launcher, which will be mounted underneath the Ghost on the port and starboard sides. And I think this is pretty clever, just a little way to launch the little missile. Oops, never going to see that again. So we're making some progress with that escape pod, but I'm going to show that a little bit later once it's really finished. The only thing I wanted to show right now is this little missile launcher, which will be mounted underneath the Ghost on the port and starboard sides. And I think this is pretty clever, just a little way to launch the little missile. Oops, never going to see that again. And now both torpedo launchers are installed, and they have this cool little button on the side that you can press to launch a little missile. So we'll do the same on the other side. Yay! The cabins are coming together pretty well. One little clarification about the instructions. So sometimes it'll show just one side, and it'll show perhaps that you need two of these plates, 1x4 plates, and one of them went here and it won't show the other. And it turns out the other one had to go on the other side. Remember, these cabins are more or less symmetrical, but sometimes the directions don't show both sides, the starboard and port sides. Anyway, another little clarification. So I made some modifications to make the greebly kind of plates fit, and it turns out, I was looking at the directions a little more carefully, and these clip pieces, there's a clip piece, were at a tiny bit of an angle. So the angle was like this, just a little bit. I'm actually exaggerating that angle a little. Just a small little angle that would give the greeble assembly a little bit more space to fit over these triangular plates, those wedge plates. And my version works too, so I'm sticking with it, but you can just follow the instructions and just be very precise about the angle of these little things. It's just a tiny little angle. Here's a tiny change I made to each cabin, adding these little storage lockers next to the bunks. And Sabine painted hers, of course. This center component, it actually lifts out. And I built this out of order. This is step number like 1600 or something. And it's super clever. It's a way to get all 4 seats into the cockpit. And then here's the opening for the ladder, little sort of hatch for the hull. But check this out. I feel like the space could be utilized a little better, like in this front part. Well, that's not Hera, but if it was, she'd be crammed right up against this front sort of portion, so the cockpit window will sit over here. She's crammed right in there, and the doorways to these cabins are way back here, and it feels like this space could be spread out a little more. So I am going to do a little surgery on this ship and going to move that ladder backward a little bit and the opening backward, and then use that cockpit space. Well, I'm going to try to make the cockpit space a little bigger. And also I want these controls to kind of be sort of not free floating, but you know, they look sort of free floating so that Hera can see through the windshield and things. And I think she can also see through this part, that gunner's turret as well, if she wants to look down. Anyway, so here's to doing some serious revisions. Here's my revised cockpit design. So we've got 4 chairs in there. I thought about doing them all in the same color. Figured that General Syndulla could afford, you know, 4 chairs that are the same, but this version is just so fun and charming, you know, whimsical and stuff, so I just left it as is. Also, these control sort of units have a little control yoke so that they can struggle against the yoke, pull on the levers and things. I'm sure the Ghost has a fly-by-wire system, but still, you know, pulling on the controls dramatically is dramatic. So they also are sort of free-floating, and so Hera can look down into this little well and yell at Ezra and say, "Hey, you're not shooting good. Shoot better." Things like that. That sounds like Hera, right? Anyway, at some point I'll also build up these edges like here and here so that there's more of like a control system kind of feel to it. The one worry I have is that this might be too tall. Like Hera is really sticking up here, and I'm not sure I have a cockpit piece that'll cover everything. So I might have to lower this unit. That's something I forgot to mention. The whole cockpit is raised up a little bit, and so it means that the space underneath, there's a little more height, so somebody could sit there and watch. Let's pull this up. All right, there we go. So like somebody could sit here and watch Ezra and Kanan dueling in this little area, you know, practice dueling. They can't stand, but they can sit. So that height might be too much though for the cockpit. We'll see. 788 steps into this. We've got a bathroom or a head on the starboard side now. Little toilet, sink, and shower. The cabins are done. Here's Sabine's fancy cabin with all the paint and stuff. Hera, and over here is Ezra and Zeb's, and then here's Kanan's cabin with a lightsaber on the wall. And then aft, we've got this big grid sort of structure of Technic. I think it looks pretty cool, but it's going to be totally covered up. And then on the bottom, we've got the beginning of this sort of fin structure, which will be covered by plates and tiles pretty soon, but there's the skeleton of it. This aft portion of the Ghost is turning out to be pretty huge. This whole deck area, this is 20 by 28 studs, and the original instructions show this as lounge space with a Dejeric table in here. That's the chest with monsters kind of thing that's typical in Star Wars spaceships, and maybe some cargo over here, and that's kind of it. And then this space is a galley with a table. So that's all cool. That's a perfectly valid way to design your ship, but I want my version of the Ghost to have a head that is a bathroom. So toilet and shower is going to be over here. The lounge, I'm going to kind of pop back a little bit and include the galley in the lounge, and then this aft portion is going to be engineering. One thing I wanted to install in the cockpit, or actually just a little aft, was a little place for Chopper to connect to. So here's that whole structure. This is the droid connection piece. And the problem with this is it's a reversed tile, so it's got studs on the back, which means I have to design some sort of special connection for it. So I started off with one of these bricks with the studs on the side and just put this 2x3 plate on it. There we go. And then a little extra backing. And then I can install this little droid socket. There we go. And now it's just a matter of placing it on something. So I built this little bit, which is a couple 1x3 plates, a 1 stud plate, and then this tile. And that way I can put this bad boy on it. There we go. And now this whole structure can be installed just aft of the cockpit. The Ghost is upside down. Okay, so here's this little detail. This is the aft portion. There's this plating over here and some cool angles. And then we have this other angle. It's very hard to create compound angles in Legos, so any attempt to do so is a big challenge, where it's got an angle going one way and also an angle going this way. Anyway, there's this big huge gap right over here, and I'm not sure that's going to get filled in. I don't think it will, so I might have to modify it. We're going to see. So we're looking at the underside of a couple other versions of the Ghost. This is the official Lego version, where this aft portion is pretty much flat except for some built up stuff. I like where the landing gear are because this will better balance the ship. Here's the Hot Wheels version, where it's pretty much flat except for this sloped bit out here. I like this version, so I'm probably going to do the modifications. It is the underside, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I think I'm going to change this so that it's just wedge plates all the way out to about here, and then I'm going to finagle this. I'll probably just use the same thing, but cut it down, and that'll be the aft underside. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because it's just the underside, and I'm not really going to see it a lot. I really love this greeble sort of angle though, so definitely I'm keeping that. So here we are, we're into the revision, and I tore all this back and I started building this out with some more Technic frame and these plates. This is 2 plate stacks, and then this portion is kind of like the original, but it's shortened. It's only 4 studs in this direction, and then there are these little clicky hinge plates that are still being used, just as in the in the original. Built it up a little bit with some bricks. Now we add some plates, add a few greebles, and I think we're done. This is all pretty sturdy, pretty stable. I wouldn't pick up the ship here, but it's stable enough. Next step is to reattach these little thingies over here and kind of slope these bits out. Also, these panels aren't quite attaching, and this kind of annoys me. I think this fin is supposed to be like 1/2 stud further this way to the forward part or something. I might have built it wrong, but this is bothering the heck out of me. So I'm going to tear up these plates and put in some bricks with studs on the sides to allow these parts to go right up against the hull. All the modifications to the underside are complete. So we've got these little slopey bits on both sides. They're not quite symmetrical, but it's the underside of the ship, so it doesn't matter that much. Or at least that's what I keep trying to tell myself. Then here's these slopey parts. These look really cool. I'm very happy with how they came out. They're also pretty sturdy. They're not going to get knocked around too much. And the last bit is over here. These plates were kind of loose, and so I tore up some stuff and installed some bricks with studs on the side, and so now they're nice and solid. So this, except for when I attach landing gear, this should be the last time I'm looking at the underside, flipping this ship over like this. I think. We'll see. Looking at the aft half of the ship, we've got this area that's pretty much complete. I'm going to give a full tour later on. We've got our lounge and the head, galley, engineering, but we also have these big spaces over here now with a nice floor, or at least it's the subfloor, I guess. And I think these are going to become cargo bays. So this one, the port side, will be accessible from outside the ship. This one also accessible from outside the ship, but there will also be this little opening here so that people can load stuff in through the airlock, go in through the airlock and then load cargo here, or they can load cargo in from outside. We'll see how that goes. This is the aft end of the ship, like where the engines go, and it's got lots of cool greebly detail, and I followed the directions for the most part, but bumped up the symmetricalness of it a little bit. And now these greebly bits are mostly attached. They go onto some studs on the side, and we have this cool little bit here where it's a bunch of studs that'll help this stick together. And then there's this engine detail that will go right here. So I wanted this to be a little bit more symmetrical than what the directions showed, because I figure it's a spaceship, and the idea of a spaceship is you're traveling around in this incredibly hostile thing called space, and you don't want to be futzing around with your engines, kind of tinkering around, making do with spit and twine and things. You want to do your engine repairs properly, or not at all. Stay out of space if your engines don't work. So symmetrical means not cobbled together. They're still kind of asymmetrical though, because it looks cool. Here's a bit of the Ghost's hull plating, and I want to show off how these parts go together. So they're stuck together with a hinge right now, and they interlock or mesh together so well. It's just super impressive, I think. And there's a hinge that goes right here. And now they're locked together. Pretty cool. And here's what the panel looks like installed. Now, one problem, so it opens up and that's cool, but I want to make this so that there's a little cargo loading door somewhere in there, so I might have to modify it. Now we have this portion attached, which makes sort of a gradual long curve. Let's see how visible that is. Anyway, this is built out of a bunch of these little parts, and then they're just joined together with a bunch of black pins. So we'll just do two to demonstrate, and then they're twisted this way just a tiny bit to create that little bit of a gradual change from being fairly flat, parallel to the ground, to being a little bit more vertical to the ground over here. Here's a little engine component, and it uses some brackets on four sides, and then these pieces are just pieces with studs on the side and then tiles, and it creates this nice round shape, and that'll be part of the engine. I show the Saturn V in the background because it used a lot of the same sort of technique. So I wonder if 2Bricks designer was inspired by the Saturn V. This is one of the coolest sets ever, uses incredibly insane building techniques, and it separates into the different stages. I absolutely love it. I installed a bunch of the hull plating, and it's symmetrical, so they look the same on both sides. And also these big honking engines. Unfortunately, I think I did it wrong because, let's see, overhead, maybe you can see this, there's a little bit of a bowing together at the end. So they should be parallel, but instead they're like coming together toward the end. And then also there's a little bit of breakage. I don't know if you can see that, but these are at angles that they shouldn't be. Things just aren't quite sticking together properly. And so I don't know if this is the original design or if it's because I made like a million modifications to this aft part. I bet it's the million modifications that I'm making. And I think I've got the engines fixed now. They're parallel to each other. And now I can easily fit in this sort of decking here. So this is for the Phantom 1 or 2. And then here's the little, I suppose that's the airlock sort of thing for entering that ship. One thing I want to make a change though is I want this to be tall enough for crew to stand in. Right now they'd have to kind of duck their heads a little bit. They still have to crawl in through this small doorway, but still, this little ante-room I want them to be able to stand up in. So I'm going to change that a tiny bit, where the ceiling will come up to the same place it is now, but the floor is going to go down, is going to be several plates lower so that crew can stand up there. So let's talk a little bit about these big, huge honking engines here. So when the ship is flying forward, presumably its center of mass is somewhere, in the center of the ship. The center of mass is where all the mass of the ship is balanced. So the same amount above and below, same amount in front and behind it, and same amount from starboard and port. So when the ship is flying though, through space or atmosphere, these big, huge honking engines are going to be pushing the ship forward, but also slightly downward. And so it's going to make a big circle. And that's no good. You can't have that if you're trying to fly a spaceship. But meanwhile, these engines, these smaller engines, are pretty much right in line with the ship's center of mass, or, where I assume it is. So here's the solution I came up with that kind of satisfies this problem for me. These two engines, the smaller ones, these are for space. So the ship is flying through space. There's two of them, so there's a little redundancy. If one fails, the other takes over. Also, they can adjust their power depending on where the ship's center of mass actually is, how much cargo it's got. And then these big honking engines, these are the atmospheric engines. So when the ship is flying through atmosphere of a planet or something, the aerodynamics of the spaceship plus its shields result in placing these big, huge engines at the top. And maybe the engines can take in elements of the atmosphere, maybe they cool the ship, I don't know. But atmospheric engines, space engines, and that's good enough for me. I solved the problem with the engines. Turns out I installed them wrong. They were one stud forward too far, and now they're not. They're where they are in the instructions, and they fit a lot better. Everything works. These lever thingies can go down all the way. Also, I rebuilt this little chamber. It's now just a little bit deeper so that crew can actually stand up in there. Not by a whole lot, but enough. It's enough. And also it's just another little space on the ship. I'm really impressed by how many little nooks and crannies there are on this vessel. And I built this piece. This hull plating is entirely following the instructions. Pretty sure, anyway. And it fits very nicely in this little area. Although I'm holding a camera, so we'll see if this works. There we go. It took two hands. But it's a beautiful fit. Looks cool. I love all the yellow trim. This is supposed to be yellow, but I didn't have any yellow slopey pieces like that, so instead it's that sort of dark tan. Looking good. Getting close to done here. So we've got this part, which is going to go here. Now it doesn't quite fit properly because I changed the cockpit, so I'm gonna have to tweak this a little bit. And then there's this portion which fits on top. And I want to show this bit with the ball and socket joints. I think this is just very clever the way this was done. And these two parts go together. And then we're gonna hook it up here. It's pretty seamless. I mean, it's not seamless right now because I need to tweak all this stuff at the cockpit, but I'll get to it and then we'll show the whole thing put together. Here's the situation now. We've got this whole front panel that fits in place nicely, and I tore a bunch of stuff back to make enough space for this big cockpit that I've got going here with its 4 seats. So some changes I need to make. These are swivel seats, but I'm gonna take away the swivel so that they have some cool looking controls to deal with. And also I need to build some sort of cockpit cover thingy with a big windshield here. So I gotta figure that out. Here's cockpit cover solution number 1. I'm not crazy about it. There's a lot of these clip and bar kind of arrangements, like here, 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 here. Oh, that part's not done. And it just looks sloppy and kind of, well, I don't know, shoddy, not very airtight. The part I do like, however, is this windshield. And then here's this little part here. They're separate parts, but they kind of go together, or at least well enough. So I'm gonna keep this aspect, but I think I need to try again with all this stuff. This version of the roof for the cockpit is a little better. It's more bulbous than what they show in the animation and on the Ahsoka series, but it means that I can have a relatively full-size cockpit in there with 4 seats and controls and things. I can open this up without having a humongozoid ship. Also, check it out. I put this in, and this is original. I didn't make any changes to this at all. And the designer has this cool little mechanism that allows this gunner's turret to rotate. So that's super cool. So we're basically done here. The only thing left is to attach landing gear, but I decided against it because the whole ship tilted backward when I put the 3 landing gear in place. And there's actually in the instructions, there's a little piece to attach to that sort of gray fin we see back there, which would prevent the ship from tilting backward. But it's better, in my judgment, to just go without landing gear. It's fine. So let's start this final tour off right. We're gonna take a look around the outside. Overall, this ship took me a little more than 2 months to build. So we'll start off at the very front, where there's this gunner's turret, and that can be opened up. We can put Ezra or whoever in there. There's a control panel, and there's also the gun. This is a thing I modified, that's pretty early on, to make sure that it could swivel up and down as well as from side to side. The original could only swivel side to side. Here's a door. This is the main hatch that they get in and out of the ship. Now this would lower a lot more if I had landing gear installed, but I opted to go without landing gear. Underneath the Ghost, we've got a couple torpedo launchers, one on each side. And I'm gonna demonstrate this. Here's this little button on the side, and that shoots the little projectile. Pretty awesome. Here's the cockpit. This is the site of a major modification because I wanted a bigger roomier cockpit that was elevated a little bit, and so I had to create this sort of bubble shape, which isn't how it looks on the show, or any show at all. We've got all these cool greebled sides. I love how all of these angles were made. For the most part, these angled plate assemblies are the original design. I didn't change them very much, although there was a little modification, like here's a cargo hatch, a loading hatch, so they can load cargo in there, and there's some barrels of stuff. This central sort of region, like over here and then on the port side, I modified that a lot. So we're gonna tour this pretty extensively. For now, let's just have a look inside this airlock. We can open this door and it then retracts. And we see inside, there's the airlock. And the inner doors are closed, because of course that's how you wanna run an airlock. On the other side, the port side, we have an escape pod. And I'll show that in greater detail when we start looking at the interior, but this whole sort of door just kind of blasts open and the escape pod can get out. Over here we've got yet another cargo hatch, loading hatch. Oh, we don't see anything in there at the moment though. Also on the outside, let's see, we've got this cool assembly. I showed this in the building video. A little knob turns this turret, and we can actually load a minifigure in there, although nobody's in there at the moment. This can raise and lower as well. We have big, huge honking engines at the back, and the way I run the show, the way I think of it, these are atmospheric engines, the big, huge honking ones, and that somehow works out with the aerodynamics of the ship and the shields and, you know, stuff. And then these are the space engines. They're more in line with the ship's center of mass. They're smaller. They don't need to push against atmospheric drag or anything. This is where one of the Phantom ships would go. And I don't have either Phantom built yet. I think I'm going to go with Phantom 1 though. I just like that ship better. We're going to start looking at the insides now. So as I mentioned before, this opens up, but then we can also just open this entire assembly to see inside that cargo bay. Not a whole lot to see in there, in that cargo bay anyway. The other one I have kind of, I don't know, with more stuff in it. We've got all these barrels and some engine equipment, and then, wait a minute, what's that? Uh-oh. I don't know. That looks like stolen Imperial goods. We'll just pretend we didn't notice it. We'll just close that up and move on. Okay, so here's the airlock, and so I showed this before, but now we're going to open it up a little more. So here's that opens up. We can also pull this hatch up, and we see the inside of that airlock. So there's some controls to show like pressure changes. There's the inner doors that open. In the Star Wars universe, of course, all the doors are slidey pocket doors, but that's hard to do in a Lego spaceship. So no sliding doors on this. Over here, we see a little hatch to get into one of the two heads. That's one of the changes I made. The original design didn't have a bathroom anywhere. And then here's another hatch to get into that cargo bay. So the little hatches are my modification. The airlock in the original instructions looked much closer to the design in the show. It was sort of like a round octagon, but it wasn't, you know, functional. There's my air quotes. Like, it didn't have an actual airlock. It was just for show. And it looked cool, but I wanted an airlock. So here it is. It's got an airlock. On the port side, we had, remember, that escape pod, so we'll open that door. This is how it blasts out. But of course, we can open these various things, so we can push that escape pod out and admire it for all its escape poddiness. Pottiness. All right, these doors would be open normally so that they can get in and out of the little escape pod, but we can also just pop the top off of it. Not a lot to see. There's a control panel at the front where we have that Star Wars windshield. Here's with loading doors opened up. It's just a big empty space for hopefully 5 or 6 crew members. And here's the little tracks where the escape pod would shoot out. And if we look inside there, there's some storage boxes and control panels, which are barely visible. Anyway, have a little bit of a problem with the idea of an escape pod. Like, if your ship is actually literally exploding, are you really going to be able to get to an escape pod to escape an explosion? I don't know. I think not. Or if your ship isn't exploding, then it seems like you'd be better off just sticking with your ship. And, you know, it's a derelict, but it's better than this. I mean, you could maybe pressurize the place. You'd still have your extra oxygen and rations and water. But whatever. Escape pods are in the Star Wars universe, so I put in an escape pod, and also it meant that I didn't have to build 2 airlocks, which was good. Now let's start looking at the aft interior. So first we can lift this away. This is totally unmodified from the original instructions. But then this part I modified a little bit so that this sort of airlock area is a little deeper so that little minifigures can stand up in there. And they could also get between here and a ladder that goes up to this gunner's turret. So this is all more or less continuous. Here's tiny little doors to get into the Phantom. Over here we've got a fake door. Doesn't go anywhere. Try to get through, it doesn't go anywhere. But sometimes fake doors, you just, you know, let's put in a fake door because we just don't have room to do real doors. And then we can lift this whole assembly away and start getting into the really cool interior. So the interior of this aft portion I really changed up quite a bit. Here's some parts that weren't modified though. This is original instructions with this cool sort of round couch and the Dejeric table, I think that's what it's called, and other chairs. But then I started going way off script and like, here's this galley. The original instructions called for a galley, but it was more aft and it's actually bigger. I wanted just a small galley with kind of futuristic looking look to it, and it couldn't be too big. The sink and the microwave kind of details are actually from the Seinfeld set, so that's cool. So it had to look futuristic, it had to be compact, it had to be recognizable as a kitchen. Here's a ladder, there's Chopper. So that ladder would be to get up to the Phantom 1 or 2. Now we're checking out the port side. So on the port side we have a machine shop. Basically there's machine tools over there and also that crazy funky chair. There's also a Dejeric table from the Millennium Falcon set, but I'm calling it like Star Wars dartboard. Over here is the main head. There's a door there, and then shower, toilet, sink, and fancy soap. So that's the main head. There's also another one that I'll get to later. And then we go aft, and this was the galley in the original design, but I made it into the engine room. We have a hyperdrive motivator. Here's like a control panel kind of thing. I stole the sticker from a Millennium Falcon set. Over here is a droid socket. That was kind of a challenging installation. It's not focusing very well. And then over here is like engine stuff. There's some levers and control panels. It's engine stuff. And pipes, of course, because pipes always look cool in spaceships. Now we're looking at this front area. So the cockpit in the show, it isn't nearly this bulbous, but I made it like this because the cockpit is actually elevated somewhat and it's a little bigger So we've got Hera in there, and there's the 4 seats, there's controls, there are kind of floating controls, there's also a little bit of space so that they can, Ezra or whoever can get down there to go man that forward cannon. And we can close this up, and then we can lift this entire contraption away. And now we can see a lot more interior space. So there's the cockpit once again. It's elevated somewhat, and that's a change from the original instructions. There's another droid socket for Chopper, or I guess whoever, but Chopper. Here's Hera's quarters, where there's Jason, and there's that, I can't remember the name of it. It's some sort of artifact or a family heirloom of the Twi'lek people. Here's Sabine's quarters that's all painted up. Zeb and Ezra's cabin with these flowers where I don't know what these are. Maybe it'll come up. I'm on season 3 now, like midway through. Maybe it's gonna come up. Here's Kanan's cabin with lightsaber. And this cool little hatch sort of thing to get through to the aft compartments, and also to this crossway to get to the airlock on that side and the escape pod on the port side. And another thing is that this whole thing lifts out. Oops. Lifts out, and then we see a cargo bay, and we've got that sort of loading kind of area. And this was a space where Kanan and Ezra were dueling in one episode. I think ideally I would have made that a little wider, maybe 8 studs wider, but whatever. Not changing it now. And this space, I really wanted people to be able to stand here, but, oops, that's building detritus. I just couldn't do it. People can sit here. There's enough room to sit, but you can't stand. So that's how it is. And so we have kind of this split level deal where we've got the bottom floor, and then this is kind of a half floor, and then the cockpit is up here. And then also that hallway. We can also open up these spaces, which in the original design were just open spaces, but I wanted them to have cool little stuff in there. So on this side, we've got tanks of various sorts, like that could be water, oxygen, nitrogen stuff. Here's that second head. It's pretty cramped, actually. There's not much headroom. You kind of have to squat, which is kind of the point of a bathroom anyway, a head, I should say. So it's fine. And then over here, I really like this bunch of greebly details. It just looks cool. If you're trying to do greebles in a spaceship, pipes are always going to help. Here's kind of a bizarre view showing the whole thing opened up all the way, except for these parts. They flip open, but gravity pulls them right back down. And so we can see the whole thing: greebles, cargo bays, cabins, the cockpit. Well, the cockpit isn't in there now because I took it out. Let's put it back in. There we go. Now the cockpit's back there, and then of course we've got this aft space, the engines, engine room, the whole thing. And that's the Ghost. Lots of modifications. You could get that 2Bricks design and just build it exactly according to the instructions, and you're going to have just a terrific spaceship. Or you can go off script and modify it like I did. It's all good. Either way, you're going to come up with a really terrific spaceship. So that's the Ghost.